Hey, hi, welcome. Kevin here from Provoking Safety. One of the duties on a health and safety committee is to make recommendations to the employer. Now, recommendations to the employer are made for a few reasons. To rectify safety issues and safety deficiencies, obviously, but also to make recommendations that will benefit the overall health and safety of the organization and the members of the organization's community, also helping the employer to meet legislative requirements. But the question is how to make a good one that's going to be considered by the employer and the corrective actions contained in it are going to be implemented. I've made a lot of mistakes in making recommendations to the employer, so using them, let's look at how you and your health and safety committee can make effective recommendations to the employer. But before I get on to that, I want to thank each and every one of you that has taken the time to click that subscribe button and to ding that little bell so that you get notified of content when it comes up on the channel. I also thank you for all of the feedback that I receive, whether it be through comments or likes or dislikes. I appreciate all of that feedback, so thank you. Why recommendations? I already outlined some of the obvious ones: keeping in compliance with the legislation, making the workplace safer, addressing safety deficiencies. But there's also a big one that we need to look at. It provides that active participation for all of the members of the organization through their representatives on the Health and Safety Committee to be involved with the health and safety program by making recommendations to the employer. That idea of authorship and ownership bringing about commitment, so it just creates a better, healthier, and safer workplace. Now, there's two types of recommendations to the employer. There's a formal and an informal. An informal recommendation to the employer is really good. It's like flipping a switch. It's used especially where there's not a big bunch of budgetary requirements. It's not going to require a lot of money, just some discretionary spending. Or it doesn't require a lot of operational change. In other words, no changes to policy, rules, or a significant amount of the employee workforce has to be diverted to correct it. So for instance, it's not going to require a whole pile of training or a whole bunch of employees to carry out the corrective actions. It often isn't used for where there's non-compliance issues with the legislation. On that note, formal recommendations to the employer are made especially where there's legislative compliance issues to deal with, or there's significant budgetary requirements, or an operational change such as new policy has to be written, or policy has to be rewritten, or rules have to be changed, or equipment and facility alteration is required. These are also really how you need to address things like incident investigation, corrective actions. Now, formal recommendations to the employer are also a bit different because they do require, in most jurisdictions, a hard copy with co-chair signatures. It's also really should be noted that they also provide a good starting point if there's involvement with the authorities having jurisdiction, such as occupational safety officers. When they're checking into a situation, they may want to know if there's been a recommendation of the employer. Both recommendations, whether they be informal or formal, have some commonalities. First off and foremost, when you're making a recommendation to the employer, note the background. During an inspection, this was noted, or during an incident investigation, this was noted and the corrective actions are. Provide the employer with all of the issues at hand, and if there's legislation that needs to be referenced, it has to be referenced or quoted ad verbatim within that recommendation to the employer. A lot of times employers will just skim by quoting it. It's up to you on how things work best in your organization. What I've done in the past is I've usually quoted the legislation unless it's going to make it a long read. Now, you also need to provide the employer with all of the information to make the decision. If you have to ask additional questions, or somebody on the committee reads it and has to ask additional questions, your employer is going to need to ask them too. So make sure that you clarify the whole situation to the employer in that recommendation. Also, it's very important, utilize the hierarchy of controls in their order of importance. Now, if you need to know more about the hierarchy of controls, keep an eye up in this corner and I will leave a link to a video on the hierarchy of controls. Also provide clear, practical solutions. It isn't necessarily going to be solved by throwing entire piles of money at it. Provide a good practical solution and possible alternatives and options should the employer need to do something else to reach the same end. You need to indicate a reasonable timeline. Now, on the note of timelines, Some jurisdictions provide a response time that's a requirement by the employer. For example, the employer is required to respond within 21 days or 30 days. This doesn't mean rectification of the incident or the issue at hand. It means a recognition and a responsive receipt of the recommendation of the employer. So don't make your expectations unreasonable. Now, the other thing that you should outline is who on the committee will be the liaison for this recommendation to the employer. Now, there's a couple other points that I want to make regarding recommendations to the employer. Avoid opinions. Nobody cares about your opinion. Nobody cares about mine. Nobody cares about yours.
You know, we don't really care about your opinion.
So avoid opinions. Make sure that you deal with facts. Facts don't care about your feelings, but facts are easily dealt with. And guess what? Feelings aren't part of the facts. Don't be spiteful or adversarial. Nothing good comes out of it. Regardless of the current labor relations state in your organization or any existing labor relations issues, don't be spiteful or adversarial. No good comes out of it. Don't use the recommendation to the employer process as a lever either. Use them in the spirit that they're intended. Make sure that you're using them so that you can make the workplace a healthier and safer place to work for all of the employees. So once again, just looking at the whole process, if you're making an informal recommendation to the employer, it needs to be noted in the minutes for the Health and Safety Committee meeting. However, anything else can be done through email and normal communications as long as there's some sort of follow-up that can be entered into the minutes at a subsequent meeting so that it's clear that the recommendation's been satisfied. If it's a formal recommendation, once again, needs to be a printed hard copy with both co-chairs signing it. Both of them have to include the issue at hand, how it came about, some background, and the purpose for the employer addressing it. You need to include and quote any codes or regulations that are being addressed. Make sure at minimum you reference them. You need to include a proposed practical solution and alternatives. There has to be an expected, reasonable timeline that the employer can use to satisfy it. Also, you should, as a committee, take into account current organizational priorities. Remember, if you put a lot of thought into it and it's evident, your employer will notice that as well. You need to note who on the committee can be a liaison. If it's the co-chairs, great. If not, if you're including another person on the committee, especially an expert in the situation at hand or a subject matter expert, note them as the go-between. Also, it's very important to make sure that it becomes an ongoing part of the agenda, especially when the corrective action may take a significant amount of time. If you want to know more about your function or the purpose of a health and safety committee and what they do, keep your eye up in this corner and I'll leave a link to a video on health and safety committees, and actually I'll leave a playlist on health and safety committees. If you want to know more about incident investigations, I'll leave a link to the playlist on the Incident Investigation Theory and Practice series in this corner. Now, until we see each other again, please do me a favor. Actually, I really hope we do see each other again. Do me a favor. Don't just think about safety. Don't just talk about safety. Be a leader. Be an influencer. Provoke and do safety wherever you are. Take care. Bye for now.